All right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the second day of our wonderful conference, Reinventing, Reimagining the Police. We've had a set of absolutely fascinating panels yesterday, taking very different perspectives, suggesting both possibilities for reforming police, but also bringing into play much more radical perspectives of raising fundamental questions about the function of policing in our society and how the whole distribution of labor between various governmental functions should be possibly reintroduced. Today, we are beginning by sort of opening the floor for an international perspective. We have three wonderful speakers here this morning that I welcome from various locations. The first speaker that we have this morning is Adam Elliott Cooper, who is actually one of those wonderful geographers who just venture into new terrains, as they usually come out of the UK. After graduating from Oxford University, he took teaching positions at Warwick, at the University College in London, King's College, and he's now at the University of Greenwich, just outside of London. He's working on a book in the shadow of a movement, Black Resistance to Policing in the 21st Century, Britain, which is under contract with Manchester University Press. He's also a contributor to the volume Empire's Endgame, Racism and the British State, where he's teamed up with 7 other scholars to intervene in debates around racial capitalism and political crisis in the British context. The contributors argue that studies of racism have too often focused on individual attitudes and behaviors. Instead, they foreground the wider political and economic context, and especially how the legacies of empire have shaped and reshaped global capitalism. I would like you to welcome Adam.
Great, thanks very much, Andreas, for that lovely introduction. I'm just going to share my screen with you so that you can all listen to my disembodied voice whilst I show you some pictures. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about the context in which the current resistance to policing in Britain has emerged during recent months, and then I'm going to talk in a bit more detail about the most radical demands of reimagining policing or reimagining governance, social and political life that's emerging in Britain at the moment. So I guess I'm going to begin. Sorry if I'm going over ground that people are familiar with already, but I want to really make clear what the UK context is, because I know we've got lots of people outside of the UK, probably the overwhelming majority, listening in today. So I want to begin in 1707, which is quite a long time ago, but I think it's worth beginning there, because 1707 is when the Act of the Union is signed, which makes Britain a state. So it's the Act of the Union which brings Scotland and England and Wales into a singular political entity. And before 1707, England already had colonies. It had colonial outposts in the Caribbean islands, parts of what was to become the United States of America, of course, colonial outposts in West Africa and engaging in the transatlantic slave trade, as well as a number of different colonial outposts in Asia and Australasia and other places. And even Scotland, which many people are unaware of, had colonies at this time in Nova Scotia, what was to become West Virginia, and even an attempt to colonize Central America in what was to become Panama. But what Scotland realised was that they weren't really very good at engaging in colonial endeavours, and they were getting run out of town by the Portuguese and the Spanish and other far more efficient and effective colonisers. And so one of the reasons that the Acts of the Union was signed was because Scotland realised that they could only really engage in European competitive colonisation if it became part of this union, this British union. And I think this is important because what this tells us is that since its very inception, Britain has always had colonies. Right? So Britain I think it's more useful to think about Britain not as a nation state, but as an imperial state. And imperial governance has been fundamental to Britain for as long as Britain has existed. And therefore, racial governance has been is as old as Britain itself. And so a lot of the discourses we hear around Britain and racism and policing have been around the fallacy that racism is something that Britain starts to do in the post-war period as people from Britain's former colonies migrate to Britain in significant numbers. And what I want to argue instead is that British policing, most of British policing, has not taken place on the British mainland. It's taken place in its colonies, in the Caribbean, across much of, about a third of the African continent, across much of the Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asia, Australia, and the Middle East. These are the places where most of British policing has taken place for much of Britain's history, and therefore racism has been fundamental to British policing for a very, very long time. And I think this is important as well because often Britain likes to tell itself that, oh, it's not as bad as America, it's not as bad as South Africa, and of course, therefore, that creates this I guess a conceptual disjuncture between the self-image that Britain has of itself and, of course, and its colonial legacies, the United States and South Africa possibly being two of the most pronounced of those colonial legacies. Right, so I'm going to begin with maybe two or three whistle-stop tours of examples of British colonial policing. The first is in Morant Bay in the Caribbean island of Jamaica, following the formal abolition of slavery. And by this time, a police force as we know it hadn't yet been established, but there were militias, volunteer militias, and other forms of policing which were used to control the colonised populations in Jamaica during the mid to late 1800s. And during the Morant Bay Rebellion, in which people rebelled against, so a lot of the plantation owners, when slavery was abolished, left the plantations to rot, and so a lot of Jamaican people went to work on those unoccupied lands and were eventually criminalised for doing so. And this was a protest against that criminalisation, which led to hundreds of colonial soldiers killing, arresting, executing, as well as burning the homes of hundreds more. And so what we see here are forms of racialised and very racist colonial policing on the part of Britain, but not on the British mainland. The second example is from the rebellions in India in the mid to late 1800s, where again we see very spectacular forms of criminalisation and corporal and capital punishment being deployed by the British colonial administration. And the final example is from the 1950s and 60s in the East African colony of Kenya, where again we see British policing using forms of mass incarceration, mass punishment, and both corporal and capital punishment against hundreds of thousands of Kenyan people during a period of anti-colonial unrest. And what's important in these colonial contexts, I think, is that in these colonial contexts, the military and the police are one. There is a continuum, a very clear continuum between one and the other. Whereas on the British mainland, there was an attempt, or at least on paper, to create a division between the domestic policing and military endeavours. And this is important because we begin to see the military and the police merge more coherently in Britain during the post-war period, as significant numbers of people migrate to Britain in significant numbers from Britain's colonies and former colonies. And so as people migrate from the Caribbean, from the African continent, from the Indian subcontinent, from the Middle East to the heart of empire, to the British mainland, we see the kinds of racist thinking, the kinds of racist ideas migrate to British policing on the British mainland as well. And here's a list that Paul Gilroy identifies of some of these racist, criminal, what he calls black folk devils, stowaways, drifters, pimps, drug dealers, muggers, illegal immigrants, black extremists, criminal Rastafarians. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what are the more contemporary black folk devils which shape British policing today. I'm going to skip that a little bit. I think this is important. So in the 1980s, we see, this is Kenneth Newman, who's head of the Metropolitan Police during this period, talking about the problem of what he calls black inner city areas and recent immigrant groups not being inculcated with law-abiding and respectable values. And this is something that Stuart Hall and his colleagues analysed in some detail in their book Policing the Crisis. But what also emerges in the 1980s are a series of urban uprisings in lower income and black communities across England. And what happens when these urban uprisings emerge is that the British police say that they're not able to deal with these black inner city areas. They're not able to. They need new they need new tools, new tactics, and new powers to deal with them. So after the rebellions in 1980, 1981, and 1985, and during this period, we see the British police take on consultancy from two other police forces, the Royal Ulster Constabulary in Northern Ireland and the Royal Hong Kong Police. And these are important because they are police forces in Britain's two remaining significant colonies by the 1980s. And what we see here is that these two colonial police forces bring the kind of colonial policing tactics used in places like both Northern Ireland and Hong Kong, but also, as I mentioned before, the Caribbean, parts of Africa and India, here onto the British mainland. The tactics of mass arrest, the tactics of mass surveillance, the tactics of forms of using firearms and other forms of weaponry, the increased use of incarceration. And importance, the ability or the social infrastructure to identify suspect communities. Right, so what do these suspect communities look like? Some of these suspect communities, unsurprisingly, are black men, as we've seen with the discourse around gangs, borrowed from the United States, which has been hugely effective. But there are, of course, many other suspect communities, whether they be Muslims or simply migrants or so-called illegals, and many others as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the problem of institutional racism in policing, very, very briefly. So here you can see. Actually, should I do that? No, actually, I'm going to skip straight. I'm going to skip over that, and instead talk about the ways in which this form of racist policing has led to a massive expansion in Britain's prison system. So over the last 30 years in Britain, we've seen a huge increase in the number of police officers. There's been a minor blip around 2010 where there were some austerity measures and cuts to public spending, but generally we've seen a concerted increase in numbers of police. As you can see from this graph, we've also seen the prison population almost double since 1980 in England, Wales and Scotland. And also the police have been given huge numbers of powers. Not only the powers that you might be familiar with, but new weapons. We've seen more and more police officers armed with firearms, more police carrying tasers as routine, but also the powers of surveillance, the power to monitor people's digital communications, monitor their social media, monitor their phone usage, identify the people that they live with or socialise with, to impose injunctions upon them. So we've had what are called knife crime orders, gang injunctions, criminal behaviour orders, and control orders. All of these kinds of orders are imposed upon people who haven't committed an offence but are suspected of being involved in gang crime, violent crime, or terrorism-related offences, hugely racialised crimes, disproportionately affecting communities of colour, which enable the police to control where people go, who they speak to, where they study, where they work, whether they're allowed to make music or not, loads of different things. And if they break these injunctions, they can receive a custodial sentence. So it's in this context that we see Black Lives Matter re-emerging in the United Kingdom. So in the summer of this year, we've seen the largest anti-racist protests in British history. We've seen hundreds of thousands of people in over 260 cities, towns and villages across the country taking to the streets and arguing for an end to this kind of policing. And so Whilst in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, you can see a statue of Colston, a slave owner who had a statue in Bristol city centre being thrown into the river by Black Lives Matter protesters. You can see in the top right-hand corner the shutting down of the main road to London's Heathrow Airport, protesting against the deportation of migrants. And on your left, you can see one of the main slogans of the Black Lives Matter movement: "The UK is not innocent." Making sure that people don't just divert attention to the United States as a place where racism and policing is a problem, but something which is very much British itself. And so through these movements, we're beginning to see ideas around defunding and with a vision to abolishing the police becoming mainstream. Arguments which seek to rebuild not simply a welfare state which would take Britain back to the 1940s and 50s, which had its own problems, but a vision in which we erode the power and resources of the prison, police and border regimes and re-empower community organisations and re-resource the kinds of community and social institutions that are necessary to keep our communities safe. And I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you so much, Adam, for this fascinating paper. Sort of opening a new vista for us here, sort of on what has been going on in Britain. Now, I would like to present you the second presenter this morning, who is Yanilda Gonzalez. Yanilda is now an assistant professor at Harvard's Kennedy School. But before, she was here at the University of Chicago at the School of Social Service Administration after receiving a PhD at Princeton University in political science. She's working on a book, or actually the book is about to come out, with the title Dissonant Security, Democratic Processes and Authoritarian Policing in Latin America. And it makes its appearance, we hope, in press. The book examines the persistence of authoritarian policing in Latin America to explain why police violence and malfeasance remain pervasive decades after democratization. It also examines the conditions under which reform can occur, drawing on rich comparative analysis and evidence from Brazil, Argentina, and Colombia. The book opens up the black box of police bureaucracies to show how police forces exert power and cultivate relationships with politicians, as well as how social inequalities impedes change. Gonzalez, Yanilda, has shown the authoritarian policing persists not in spite of democracy, but in part because of democratic processes and public demand. When societal preferences over the distribution of security and coercion are fragmented along existing social cleavages, politicians possess a few incentives to enact reform. Yanilda.
Thank you so much, Andreas, for that introduction. Let me get myself set up here. So thanks again, Andreas, for moderating this conversation, and to Julie and Go in particular for organizing this conference, and to all the wonderful contributors to this really important debate. So my own work on policing focuses precisely on police reform and the challenges that it entails. But the kind of key takeaway from my work is that it is fundamentally a political process. And so my book, which has the title has changed since I sent in that bio, but which will be out later this year with Cambridge University Press, shows, as Andrea shows, that ultimately understanding the persistence of what I call authoritarian policing and reforms to promote democratic coercion are both the result of ordinary democratic politics. And the key to understanding this is what I call the structural power of the police to constrain policy agendas. So because police control a fundamental function of the state, the provision of security, they can credibly threaten to withdraw it. And this can empower them to compel politicians to engage them in accommodation. And so it is this structural power that is at the heart of what I want to talk to you about today, which is what I call the reform gap in policing. And I'll give you some examples of how this manifests. So one manifestation of the reform gap is the discrepancy between what societal and political mobilization initially demands from policing and ultimately the type of reform that is enacted. So in Chicago in 2016, and really every year since probably, but in 2016, a specific case was the widespread mobilization for police reform following the killing of Laquan McDonald, right? These demands focused on robust external oversight and accountability of the Chicago police, including a civil society coalition that was working with the mayor's office to try to design such oversight. But the reform legislation that was ultimately passed essentially maintained the status quo. It just kind of changed the name of a civilian entity that investigates police misconduct from IPRA to COPA, right? And so essentially what civil society advocates were demanding and what they charged was that this reform legislation that was enacted did little to address their critiques about the agency's independence, and it actually did not do very much to increase police accountability. And you can see here in the photos that they had little toy wind-up teeth to show that the legislation actually lacked teeth, which is, of course, a critique of much police reform. The reform gap also manifests as the discrepancy between the locus of deficiency, in other words, the problem, the structural problem that needs to be addressed, and the locus of reform. Here, the Minneapolis Police Department is a great example of this, in that they enacted, following the Ferguson uprisings, Minneapolis enacted all the recommended reforms that emerged in the wake of that movement, including body cameras, implicit bias training, and initiatives to build trust with communities. But they left structural oversight and accountability measures within the police completely untouched, right? Enabling the types of extra-legal violence and abuses that earlier this year resulted in the brutal killing of George Floyd. And a final manifestation of the reform gap is police that make strides in addressing some aspects of institutional development, but not others. So in the case of Sao Paulo State, which is what I'm going to talk about in more detail today, in Brazil, we saw the enactment of a set of operational reforms since the late 1990s, such as community policing, improved training, and many others that I'll talk about. And these were enacted similarly after a great deal of societal and political mobilization, urging structural reforms to curb high rates of police killings. Years later, we've seen this be a police force that has overseen dramatic reductions in homicides, which is the chart on the left, but dramatic increases, particularly in recent years, in police killings, which have come to constitute this actually only goes up to the line graph on the right-hand side only shows it going up to 20% of homicides, but actually in more recent killings, we've seen that police killings in the state of Sao Paulo reaching the equivalent of 30% of all homicides in the state. And so the Sao Paulo state case shows that police reforms can introduce, institutional advancements in some areas of the rule of law, but not others. And so it's discrepancies like this that lead me to ask why we see this recurring pattern in which enacted policies ultimately do not end up reflecting the substantive problems that generated societal pressure for reform in the first place. And what I argue is the reason for this reform gap that we see over and over again in policing is that police leverage their structural power to strategically substitute reforms that threaten their autonomy and replace them with reforms that preserve their autonomy, in which they can ultimately implement on their own. And they do this both in reaction to reforms that have already been enacted, which is not the case I'm going to talk about today, but that's one of the cases that I studied out of Colombia. But they also do so preemptively before any reform legislation is actually passed. And this power that police wield over politicians to roll back and undo reforms and prevent structural deeper reforms from being enacted. This was explicitly cited as a reason for a watered down police reform that was enacted in New York City, which saw the enactment of a weaker transparency measure that was favored by police rather than a deeper accountability and transparency legislation that was demanded by highly organized movement of communities. So what we see by one of the council members who sponsored the legislation that was ultimately passed references this police of the police pressure. So he says, right, we all have searing memories of 2014 when there was an open revolt in the rank and file of the New York City Police Department. And so if we have an opportunity to pursue a path to police reform without provoking an upheaval in the New York City Police Department, then why not? So it is this latent threat of a police revolt, right, of a police upheaval, of police withdrawing their services and generating high levels of crime and violence. This is the fear that ultimately allows police to thwart deeper reforms. And so here I just provided these examples from the U.S. to show that this is not merely a phenomenon that we see in Latin America, which is the region that I primarily study. And so I'll provide an overview of my theoretical framework of why and how police undertake these processes of strategic policy substitution to create this reform gap. And then I'll draw on evidence from the military police in the case of São Paulo state, Brazil. So key to understanding the reform gap in policing is understanding that not all police reforms are created equal, right? And this is a fact that is very well understood by police forces, but that politicians usually seem to ignore. So police reforms have different institutional objectives, and they entail different levels of threat to police autonomy and police power. So I won't go over this chart for the sake of time, but I will summarize a few key points. First, addressing entrenched police corruption and violence requires profound structural reforms and as well that change internal police structures and shift power from the police themselves to external civilian entities. So here we're looking at the right-hand side of the table here, which are the sort of stronger, deeper types of reforms to deal with these entrenched problems. But because these reforms cause a high threat to police autonomy, what we end up being more likely to see are marginal reforms like civilian complaint review boards, or operational reforms like body cameras or community policing. These reforms may change some police practices, some everyday practices in policing, but they don't change internal structures or disrupt power relationships. And so these are characterized as constituting a low threat to police autonomy. And so the takeaway of this admittedly horrible chart is that while societal mobilization may demand these deeper reforms, police tend to prefer those operational and marginal reforms, and they will do everything in their power to preempt or to roll back such structural and external oversight reforms, replacing them instead with operational and marginal reforms that enable them to maintain their autonomy. And so I'll sketch out how this process occurred in the case of the military police of São Paulo state, which is today considered a regional leader in Latin America and Brazil. This is a high capacity, high resourced, professionalized police force, in contrast to the sort of standard story of Latin American police forces, which are, just poorly trained, low resources, low capacity, etc. And so in recent decades, the kind of calling card of the military police of São Paulo has been that it has overseen a dramatic reduction in homicides, as I mentioned earlier. But the asterisk here is because, of course, many scholars and security experts today would say that this reduction in homicide in the state of São Paulo, which I showed in the chart a few minutes ago, had very little to do with police. But the important thing from our perspective is that the police still take credit for it, whether or not they caused it, and that this enables them to build their structural power. But in addition to these advancements, it also remains a highly lethal police force. As I mentioned, the police in São Paulo today carry out a number of police killings that are the equivalent of, in recent years, 20 to 30% of all homicides. And numerically, the police in São Paulo state, which has a population of about 45 million, are killing about the same number of people each year. Since about 2017, they've been killing the same number of people as all 18,000 police forces in the United States. So this is a highly important case to study, because this is a police force that goes out to train other police forces in Brazil and in Latin America, that other police officers from other countries and other states go to train with the military police of Sao Paulo, and yet it is this highly deadly force. And so how did we get here? How do we understand this reform gap, right, in the case of the Sao Paulo police? So much of this can be understood by looking to what occurred with Sao Paulo's military police in 1997. Following widespread societal and political outrage caused by televised acts of police violence in a low-income community known as Favela Naval, TV viewers all over Brazil watched police extort, torture, beat, and even kill with impunity in this poor community, this poor and predominantly Black community. The fallout from this case was severe, as groups all across all social sectors of Sao Paulo and Brazil condemned police violence and demanded accountability, not unlike what we're seeing today in the United States. But the military police faced at this time vigorous policy debates about police reform at both the state and federal level. In the National Congress, legislators even debated proposals to abolish the military police entirely. And at the state level, there were many proposals to challenge the police's disciplinary code, change police training, strengthen the use of force, strengthen restrictions on the use of force, and enable greater transparency. And so as a result of this social and political reaction to the Favela Naval incident, the military police realized that they needed to, quote, shift the focus of policing, as one high-ranking official told me. And so here I quote just some instances of officials that illustrate how police actively resisted any attempt to enact structural police reforms. So these are those that really go in deep into the police and try to change internal structures and rules, and give power to outside entities. So in his early speeches, the newly appointed military police commander was explicit in his rejection of structural reform, saying, for instance, they will only aggravate problems, right? They need not entail structural change. And he instead insisted that the solution lay in operational changes, which he called changes in police conduct, right? Behavioral change. And so for months, police engaged in work slowdowns and other forms of protest. Right, as we see here, the police ombudsman at the time said that a proposal that he had floated that changed this disciplinary code of the police met with staunch resistance from the internal police, the internal commanders of the military police, because it messed with internal police culture. But the police didn't simply resist by just blocking these reforms. It also included a set of operational reforms that I will just sketch out here. The police relied heavily on community policing, which, as one police colonel told me, was adopted because, quote, we needed some way to demonstrate that we understood that we needed to make behavioral changes. And the military also adopted additional operational reforms from the new public management model. And this was a fad in policing back in the day, when they would adopt private sector management strategies, including performance measurement, leadership training, and customer satisfaction, as a means of improving their external image. They even developed their own management system called GESPO, which they now market to other police agencies. But the consequences of these operational reforms have produced important trade-offs that really show the limitation of what can actually be achieved through police reform. So again, as I said, police take credit for having reduced crime and homicides at very high levels, but they continue to, as I also noted, pursue and to engage in very high rates of extrajudicial killings that demonstrate persistent racial discrimination. So, for example, in the state of Sao Paulo, although Black citizens are about just over a third of the population, they consistently constitute approximately 2/3 of victims of police killings. And government and judicial examinations have also shown the persistence of police death squads engaging in retaliatory police massacres known as chacinas. And moreover, we've seen the rise of what is known as the Bullet Caucus, the Bancada da Bala, a set of former police commanders turned politicians that now are legislators and create additional mechanisms to shield police from oversight. And just a reminder again, this is what these reforms have brought, is just an increase in police lethality. But I argue, and I'll wrap up in a minute. I wanted to just sort of highlight what is the unintended consequence of this trade, of this strategic policy substitution of structural reform for operational reforms, right? What happens when you put in these operational sort of image management types of reforms when facing a problem of endemic extrajudicial violence? Essentially, these reforms may help improve police capacity and performance and the police public image, but they may also make future structural and external oversight reforms less likely and more difficult to achieve. This is because it increases the police ability to resist external reforms. And just to give you an example, this is an interview that I conducted with a retired lieutenant colonel from the military police, showing that whenever there's a serious issue with the police, they appeal to the discourse of community policing. Look, the police is reforming. Whatever is happening is isolated acts. We have projects such as community policing. It is used as an alibi. So essentially, these earlier operational reforms in the future make it more difficult to enact deeper reforms, because the police can always say, "Look, we can just adopt what we've already done. It already helped us improve our performance." And we see this persisting to this day, where this is 2020, where we've seen police killings in São Paulo reach record high numbers. So these headlines show that police in the metropolitan region have increased police killings by 70%, just in the first half of 2020. But in the face of this record level violence, the proposals that continue to be floated by police and the governor are operational reforms. So here we see the governor announcing that he's in response to violence. The governor is going to announce new training for the police, as well as the adoption of body cameras, right? So we continue to see that now there's a broader set of operational policies, not just community policing and new public management, that the police are now able to appeal to, even in the face of an astonishing number of killings. So I'll stop there and sort of leave us to contemplate this conundrum.
Thank you. I'm Julian. I'm taking over from Andreas, who was having some technical difficulties. So I'll just introduce the next speaker, Musab Yunus. Musab Yunus is a lecturer in politics and international relations at Queen Mary University of London in Paris, which the website should have specified. Unfortunately, he's in Paris. That's right, Musab. Yeah. He's been at Queen Mary since 2018, and his research examines political thought in relation to empire with a focus on anti-colonialism. He's currently preparing a book manuscript on conceptions of race and global order across the interwar Atlantic. Before joining Queen Mary, he was at Cardiff, and he got his degrees at the University of Oxford and worked as a research officer at the Institute of Development Studies. And he's in Paris now, and he will tell us a little bit about France, I believe. Please, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
So yeah, thank you, Julian, and thanks to the other organisers for putting together this conference. Thanks to my co-panelists for their really fascinating presentations. So I'm going to talk about the situation in France. And when I was thinking about what to say today, earlier this week, a story appeared in the news, which is actually pretty common. So on Monday this week, a senior police officer named Amar Ben Mohammed blew the whistle on systemic racist abuse being directed at those held in custody beneath the 38-story Tribunal de Paris. So this is a major, relatively new building designed by the internationally renowned architect Renzo Piano. And it's a courthouse in Paris, and it has some holding cells underneath. And this police officer reported that there was a pattern of racist abuse directed at prisoners being held in the cells under the courthouse, so holding cells. And the website Street Press, which reported the story, mentioned that at least 3 separate investigations have been conducted. This was part of the leak, and nothing's happened. And in fact, the police officers concerned have even seen their careers progress. Now, this story didn't come as a surprise, I think, to really anyone here in France. And in fact, the friend who sent me the story on WhatsApp, who was born and grew up in a Parisian suburb, sent it to me with the caption, "Not surprised." And for decades, of course, there's been a stream of stories about police brutality and violence here, particularly against Black and Arab men. According to one count, between 1977 and 2016, French police officers or gendarmes killed an average of 16 people a year, half of them under 26. And those stories have continued and in some ways have even intensified in recent years and months. And that's been, in a pattern reflected elsewhere, a combination of unofficial phone videos and internal leaks, both of which have shed light on police brutality and French cop culture. So in December 2019, a 43-year-old black police officer in Rouen blew the whistle on a private WhatsApp group of police officers there who were exchanging racist, anti-Semitic, sexist, and homophobic messages. They called themselves racialist nationalists, and they wrote about how they were dreaming of a racial civil war. That also was not really a surprise to most people here, at least most people who've been paying attention, because of course, repeated studies have shown that French police are much more likely to vote for the far-right party, the Rassemblement National, which used to be the National Front, than the general population. And stories about police racism and brutality here increased during the coronavirus-related lockdown, which took place from mid-March to mid-May here. A steady stream of videos on Twitter showed acts of police brutality being visited on people during lockdown checks. And so up to now, I mean, these videos came out quite recently. There has been some independent verification of them. 15 of them have so far been authenticated by Amnesty International. So just to give you a sense of this, just one figure that emerged recently is that in the course of 1 week during lockdown, April 8th to 15th, 5 people died in France following police checks as a result of lockdown measures. So, unsurprisingly, these videos were shot almost entirely in the urban suburbs of the country, which concentrate the country's racialized working class and surplus populations. And during the period of lockdown, videos and accounts of police violence were flooding social media. Just to give you a sense of one, and there were many stories like this. In one of the suburbs of Paris, Les Ulis, this was in late March, an Amazon employee called Sofiane, who's 21 years old, was heading out to work to a distribution center and saw a collection of police officers, realized he'd forgotten his form. You're supposed to carry a form here during lockdown called an attestation, and he didn't have that with him. So he started to run, and of course there's a number of videos which show him being chased by the police. He's caught by the police. Then he's essentially dragged to a part of the estate which is less visible to cameras, and he's then beaten. And there is a video which shows him being beaten by police in this kind of overhang area. Then the story goes that he was allowed to go home, so he didn't get to work. Went home to his mother. His mother, of course, saw him being very seriously wounded and injured, and was concerned, and so got him in the car and started heading to the hospital. As they got in the car, the police stopped her and said, "Where are you going?" She said, "I'm taking my son to the hospital," and they issued her with a fine for not having the form as well. So, of course, in this kind of context, when you hear these kinds of stories, it's difficult to avoid the context of racism and colonialism. When you think of the predominance of people in these stories who are from immigrant communities, they're here in France because of their countries of origin, usually in various parts of Africa, were colonized by France. But I think when we talk about that, and I just wanted to say that the way that Adam, my co-panelist, talked about how racial governance is as old as Britain itself, I think exactly translates to the French context, and that's something I want to unpack a little bit more. But I think when we talk about that abstractly, it can sometimes take away from the really direct lived experience of colonial violence that many people in and connected to France still remember, right? It's still in actually people's lived experience and memory. And one conversation I had during lockdown here really brought this home to me. It was in late April. And a friend of mine who's Algerian, and she's a PhD student here, living in Paris, she sent me a video of one of the police brutality during lockdown videos of an Arab man being showered with insults by police. And this video is taken at night, and you don't actually see the man. You see the police heading towards him. He's jumped into the Seine to escape them. And you hear the police kind of shouting out various racial insults in French at him. And then he's fished out of the river and put into a van. And then at the end of the van, at the end of the video, sorry, you hear three things. You hear the screams of the arrested man, the sound of what appears to be blows being visited on his body, and the laughter of the police. And this video is pretty harrowing in part because you actually don't see the man in question. You don't see any violence. Your mind is left to fill in the images with the auditory information you receive. So the friend who sent this video to me seemed to have been unusually affected by it. She was very upset and not in a good place. And I wasn't sure why this video in particular had sparked that. Until she said to me, did I know what had happened in Paris on the 17th of October 1961? Now, for those of you who don't know this, on that day, the French police violently attacked a demonstration of pro-independence Algerians in Paris, and they were acting under the direction of Maurice Papon. Maurice Papon was a French functionary, government official. During World War II, he'd supervised the deportation of more than 1,600 Jewish people in Bordeaux. Now, this demonstration in 1961 was attacked by the police under his watch, and the estimates of the deaths ranged from 200 to 300, most of them being killed and thrown in the Seine. Of course, many decades of denial. It took until 2001 for the French government to acknowledge the 40 deaths had happened on that day, which that's acknowledged by historians to be a major underestimate. So when I told my friend, well, yeah, I did know the story of what had happened on that day, she told me for the first time, and I've known her for a couple of years, that her father had actually been at that demonstration, and he'd narrowly escaped being drowned in the Seine, but that nevertheless he was severely beaten by police and held in custody for several days, and that had been a traumatizing event for him. And I realized that seeing this Arab man being dragged out of the Seine and apparently beaten in the back of a police van in April 2020 had triggered some of those memories for my friend about what had happened to her father. And I thought about how many people actually in French cities today have direct and familial memories of those late colonial traumas that happened here and of course elsewhere in places connected to France. So as the Funambulist magazine has pointed out, 27% of the current French population was actually alive in 1961, and many people still carry that memory of that massacre that happened in Paris. So far I've been giving quite an impressionistic account, and the aim is really to give a sense not just of the stories themselves and not just of a sense of the lived experience of police violence here, but also how those stories circulate. Every story that I've mentioned to you so far came to me via a friend. And these circulation networks are important because I think they mean that the stories circulate amongst certain people, but not necessarily amongst other people, right? I think you can find plenty of people here who remain unaware of the pattern, the level, the intensity of police violence in this country. The spatialization of race and class works very effectively to segregate knowledges, experiences, and awarenesses of this kind of thing. I mean, since I moved to Paris in September last year, stories of police violence and repression during different periods of the city's history have occupied my mind, because I work on the interwar period in particular. I mean, I'm working on a book about that period right now. And anti-colonial activists from different parts of the world, Africa, Asia, Caribbean, were tracked and monitored by French police at that time. There was a special police force called Control and Assistance Service in France for the natives of the colonies, okay, emphasis there on control. And there are many continuities between that period and this period. There's an excellent historian of the French police who I'd recommend everyone takes a look at, called Emmanuel Blanchard, and he points out that, in fact, he traces this back to the 18th century, when a police force known as the Black Police was set up in the metropole in France, and one of their aims was to control the movements of enslaved people who were arriving in the metropole. And once they arrived in the metropole, enslaved Africans were not subject to slavery, but they were subject to a different set of controls, nevertheless. So the spatialization, as I mentioned, of race and class means that it's possible for some people to pretend they live in a different country, in a country where this isn't happening. Meanwhile, on an international scale, in fact, the French record is pretty widely known. So a range of international organizations have condemned the French government's record on police violence, and also police impunity, so the impossibility of getting redress for any of these things. There's organizations ranging from Amnesty International to the Council of Europe, the UN, etc. Nevertheless, French police appear impervious to reform. Just to give you a very recent example, following recent protests over the death of Adama Traoré in 2016, and a high-profile case of death by police asphyxiation in January 2020, Cédric Chouviat, the French government announced that it would ban the use of chokeholds during arrests. Now, this chokehold ban faced an immediate backlash from police unions in this country, who are highly organized and regularly engaged in protest to protect what they see as their interests. And before the ban ever came into effect, it was reversed after police unions met with the Interior Minister. So why are the French police so impervious to change? Well, I think the first thing that has to be said here is the range of analyses that go from denial to bad apples to we need increased representations tell us very little about actually why the police in any country are structured the way they are, and the ways in which across multiple sites of political authority in different countries, they work in different ways to enforce a racialized social order. And that social order, as anti-colonial activists recognized 100 years ago, is not simply national, but is global. I think that's why comparison like the kind we're doing on this panel is so important, because it helps to make connections between different manifestations of what I think we should see, and here I agree with those anti-colonial activists, we should see as a global process. So the French Pan-Africanist collective Case Rebelle talk about a break from the French nation as being fundamental to their politics. So this means rejecting for them the whole notion of a French identity. And they do that because for them it's very important to situate the repression that they face here as not something that's only specific to the French context, it's something that's connected to global racialization. The second thing I think we need to say is that these representational analyses tell us very little about race and policing, because as we know, race isn't something that exists outside policing. It's not some natural feature of people that forms the basis of discriminatory policing when you have some bad apples, etc. Race is a regime of classification differentiation that's produced precisely through practices like policing. I think recognizing that changes the kind of questions that we're asking. So just to give a quick example before I close, one of the things that's very important in the French context is the ubiquity of the identity check, the contrôle d'identité. And it's pretty similar to stop and search in the UK or stop and frisk in the US. But it's more, in some ways, more pervasive here. So these are humiliating, frequent, and intimate searches carried out on children as young as 10. And if anyone's interested, there's a Human Rights Watch report that came out last month, June, about these checks. It makes for fascinating and depressing reading in equal measure. Now, despite a mountain of evidence that these checks are a key instigator of tensions and are discriminatory, 2016 study found that a young man, quote, perceived to be black or Arab, was 20 times more likely to be stopped than others. Nevertheless, it's been very difficult to reform those identity checks, and attempts to do so have failed. They've been foiled by the police unions. So why that's the case? Well, I think Emmanuel Blanchard, the historian of the police that I mentioned, mentions that, in his view, that in the mandate of a police officer here, there's the possibility of asserting who is French and who is not. So he says, in other words, identity control allows both administratively and symbolically to bring to life the category of French and also who is not French. So the idea of performing an identity check on a 10-year-old French citizen in an immigrant suburb is also to reinforce the idea that their identity needs to be checked, or it's not a given that they're a citizen. There's a question mark over their place in the country. And when we're talking about reforms, I think there's a couple of things worth saying about the history of the French police and their relationship to the French state. One of them is that there's a very long period of consistency, and in fact, when we've seen changes in political regime in France, the police have remained fairly consistent. In that sense, they see themselves as often having a direct link with the executive, something that makes them difficult to reform. Blanchard says they are impermeable to social reforms, and he points to the connections between the Interior Ministry and the police. So the Interior Minister is actually the head of the police here. The other thing to say is that when social movements are strong, the French executive typically feels weak. And when the French executive feels weak, it relies very heavily on police repression in order to try and do away with the social movements, essentially. And right now we're in a period in France where we've seen a succession of social movements which have really shaken the country. And even just in very recent months, we went from the Gilets jaunes through to the major strikes over the pension reforms. It's a moment when the French state and the French executive feels weak. And I think that that weakness has been very directly linked to the power of the French police, and the sense the French police unions openly express their sense that the executive needs them and therefore cannot afford to reform them. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Yes, hello, everybody. So sorry for the technical difficulties. I was just thrown out for whatever reason. So I'm back and so can start to field questions. I see we have more than 100 participants in this meeting. So I would strongly encourage to use the question and answer function on your screen on the bottom line to field further questions. So I have two questions here for Yanilda to start us off. And the first one is from Jacob Thomas at UCLA. He says, Yanilda, I was wondering what the police and their family communities think of this rise of killing of police, given that it seems to be endangering their lives and they seem to become disturbing cases of essential dispensable workers. Do they have a self-sacrificial, militant, or martyr-like mentality of soldiers at war, whereby the increase police killings just motivates them even more to become even more aggressive at policing for the ostensible cause and goals of policing the industrial complex?
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for that question. I would say that there's definitely a clear relationship between police fatalities, so police officers who are killed, and subsequent killings of civilians by police. I think that sort of violent, this kind of state violence is dangerous and lethal not only for communities but also for the police officers themselves. And so what you see is, I mentioned, for instance, the rise of retaliatory police massacres. What will happen is that when one police officer is killed, his or her their colleagues will then return to that same community and kill larger numbers of people, sometimes 3, 4, 5, and sometimes even more numbers of people. We have instances of even upwards of 20 people being killed in such chacinas, right? And the most infamous case was the case of 2006 in Sao Paulo, when in response to an organized criminal group, the PCC, engaging in targeted killings of police officers, police then turned, and I believe it was about 60 police officers that were killed in the matter of a few days. Police then turned around and returned fire tenfold, engaging in the killing of upwards of 500 mostly Black young men in the peripheries of the city of Sao Paulo and Santos. And so I would say that these two patterns of violence go hand in hand, right? So I think it's a kind of a state policy that generates these modes of violence and return, as I said, tenfold to communities. I mean, I would also note that the Brazilian Forum for Public Security has also shown that Black police officers are more likely to die as well. And so it's also even the letalities of police officers itself is as racialized as those citizens that are killed by police. And so these killings do in fact come to be used as justification, as the questioner suggested, justification for further killings of communities in communities.
Thank you, Yanilda. Here's a very important question that has bugged me yesterday the whole day. And I'm glad to Kim Shapley at Princeton to ask it. So at the theme that seems emerging in this panel is the role of police unions in resisting reform. Two questions. First, what is the relationship between police unions in your focal country and the rest of the labor movement? Second, how have police been able to politically mobilize through their unions to immunize themselves from lawsuits and other personal forms of legal liability so that they can act with impunity? And that sort of addresses really all three of you. So maybe, Adam, you want to start.
So in the United Kingdom, the main police union is called the Police Federation. It's more of a membership organisation than a union. And in the United Kingdom, there isn't really the same tradition of going on strike and other forms of industrial action around when it comes to police officers. So it's very rare, if ever, you'll get police officers going on strike or having go-slows or any other kind of industrial action, including protest. What we do see is huge numbers of resources being put into individual police officers and also individual police tactics or weapons, whether it be taser usage or forms of surveillance or otherwise, in order to try to protect those increased powers or weaponry or resources which have come to the police in recent years. So there's been a massive increase in the kind of PR machinery of the police, which has really helped them to shield them from attempts at accountability. But there's also a very close connection between the Police Federation and the press. So one example was the police killing of a young black man called Mark Duggan in 2011. When they killed Mark Duggan, the first thing the Police Federation did was they released a press statement which was parroted by all of the press, in which they said there was a shootout between Mark Duggan and the police, which led to Mark Duggan being killed. It was 2 days later that they revealed that, in fact, the police officer who had been shot in this purported shootout had been shot by a fellow officer, and the bullet that was found in that police officer's radio, which stopped him from being killed, was a police-issue bullet. And what they also revealed later down the line was that they weren't even sure if Mark Duggan was even armed when they shot and killed him. And so rather than there being the more kind of traditional union infrastructure that we might be familiar with in the United States or France or elsewhere in the United Kingdom, we're seeing a more kind of pragmatic approach on behalf of the Police Federation, which provides PR resources, legal resources, and other kinds of political lobbying to prevent the police from being held accountable for various instances of police violence, as well as more structural forms of violence in general.
Thank you, Adam. Musa?
Yeah, so here, unlike the UK, the police are very highly unionized and also engage in forms of protest regularly. Since I've been here, I've seen very regular police protests. They are also very connected to the press, as Adam mentions in the UK. That's a very similar thing that happens here. And we also have these many questions that have been raised over the department, the Internal Affairs Department that's supposed to investigate allegations of police abuse. It's called the General Inspectorate of the National Police. And of course, it's widely recognized as a whitewashing operation. There is actually Mediapart, the French media organization, has an investigation into that organization on the 12th of June, which you can look at. Makes a very interesting reading. So police demonstrations are important, and the ways in which their union leaders have the ear of the Interior Minister, the direct ear, that was very visible when the chokehold ban was overturned recently. And the union leaders boast about their access to the corridors of power. And at the same time, the police are able to engage in direct demonstrations of the kind that you don't often see in many other countries. And those demonstrations can be very effective. I mean, in 1958, police demonstrations actually were part of what brought down the Fourth Republic, right? And the police have been demonstrating on the street as well as organizing through unions here for a while, for decades, and their demonstrations have a history of being particularly effective. So yeah.
Thank you, Musa. Yanilda.
Sure. Thanks so much to Kim for that question. I don't know if you remember, I was a student at Princeton, so definitely remember those LAPS seminars. So I think this is a great question, and kind of links back to the earlier question about police as workers. I think that in contrast to the U.S., police in Latin America, there is a more clear question about working conditions that can be raised, at least for street level police, who do face low pay, very long hours, very, very strict disciplinary measures, including arrest and other, even in forms of violence. And they also tend to come from the same low-income communities that then they go on to police. And they enter the police force because of very few other work opportunities. And so I think that the question of police relative to other workers is perhaps more relevant for Latin America than in the case of the U.S., where workers, police, tend to come from different types of communities. They tend to be overwhelmingly, more white, predominantly white, and et cetera, and sort of quickly escalate to higher class than is the case for police in Latin America. The question of police unions, I think, is a really interesting one. There aren't legally constituted police unions in the way that we have them in the U.S. So there are organizations of police that sort of call themselves unions, although there's not the kind of legal obligation to engage in collective bargaining with them in the ways that we see with the U.S. But what I would say about police unions in the U.S. And how that there's similar forms of power at play as to those that I mentioned in Latin America is that police unions are just a case of the structural power of police that I mentioned. Their ability to leverage work stoppages, other force measures to get politicians to negotiate with them, right? So when we think about police union contracts in the U.S., which are so often cited as this like standalone barrier to reform, those reforms, those contracts didn't emerge, were sui generis. They did not just emerge out of nowhere. They came out of political processes and negotiation, much like the strategic policy substitution that I discussed earlier. So I think it's really important to see police unions and these police union contracts as exercises of this structural power that all police forces have and exercise to organize, to use their militarized structures to be able to get all their members in line, and to be able to exert power over politicians to get their prerogatives enacted. I wanted to just acknowledge a question that I answered. I don't know if you had seen it, Andreas, but it was about slavery, the legacies of slavery in Brazil.
Would have come later, but
okay,
you can do this right now.
I wanted to just sort of quickly mention that Brazil, similarly, because it did, of course, bring in a much larger proportion of enslaved Africans than came into the United States. It's not surprising that police would also have its origins in the enforcement of slavery, the arrest of those who tried to free themselves from the shackles of slavery in a similar form. And so, having abolished slavery only in 1888, the formation of police very much was shaped by these tasks of enforcing this racial hierarchy, which is something that continues to take place to this day. In a country that has the largest Black population outside of Africa. So I just wanted to sort of flag that as a similar legacy that may even be related to the colonial legacies that the other panelists refer to. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Wonderful, thank you. So I have a question here from Nanako Tamaru that goes a bit in a different direction. So she asks, thank you to all the speakers. You shared a lot of examples of problematic or lacking police reforms. Are there any comparative examples of positive deviance? So is there something, sort of in the record of the British, the Brazilian, the French police that Americans can learn from, or vice versa? All three of you. So.
Well, I'll just quickly say that I think anybody who studies policing and police reform quickly comes to the realization that once you let laws can be successfully enacted, and they can, my book goes over two comprehensive, highly profound reforms accomplished in the case of the Colombian National Police and the Police of Buenos Aires Province. In the case of the Colombian police, we did see a police force that built up, as I said, its capacity, that did dramatically reduce the number of killings, engagements in massacres, torture, all these sorts of practices, but that continues to this day to engage in extrajudicial killings, acts of corruption. And so reform is not a cure-all in the absence of broader political and social shift, is what I would say. So we've seen, for example, in the instance, as I think Musab in particular was mentioning the policing of the lockdowns and quarantine orders. We've seen a huge number of killings of Black Colombians in various cities as a result of police enforcement. And so reforms can only go so far in the absence of broader political and social shifts.
Yeah, so I think here in France, it's interesting because sometimes you see movements towards reform, particularly, let's say, in the judicial branch or elements of the legislative branch. And the fact that they do not make it through into actual police reform, I think tells you a lot about how the system is working and where the reform is not happening. So just one case I think is really telling. In 2015, the two highest courts in the country, the Court of Appeal and the Court of Cassation, both sanctioned the French state for, quote, allowing security forces to conduct arbitrary identity checks on citizens based solely on their personal features. So these are the contrôle d'identité that I was talking about, right? That's been sanctioned by the two highest French courts in the country. The French executive branch, then they appealed the first ruling on the basis that they agreed that Black and Arab people were more likely to be stopped, but they said that was because they were more likely to be undocumented. And therefore, what the police were doing was actually within their remit. It was not discriminatory. They were just trying to find undocumented people, which I think in itself is a very telling argument. But there was not the political capital or willingness to translate those court appeals into police reform on the ground. And in fact, when we see legislative initiatives to transform the police, often those initiatives are actually coming from the police unions. I'm just going to mention a recent one that happened earlier this year in May. There was actually an attempt to bring a law to prevent what they call the production or distribution of images of the police. So basically to make illegal, to render illegal videos of police brutality. That got the support of about 30 parliamentarians here. So it didn't go through, and it didn't really come close to going through, but it got it got a level of support, and it was widely reported in the press. And so you see these contradictory tendencies, and the question is, what kind of reform process is going to make it all the way and is going to be able to generate a kind of coalition that is actually able to reform the entrenched power structure that the police has here? And I think it's a difficult question.
Adam.
I think in the United Kingdom, although I can't think of a specific reform, I mean, there have been many inquiries and many attempts to reform the police, and none of them have had any significant impacts, even reduction of evidence of institutional racism, significant reductions in police violence or brutality, or reduction in levels of stops, searches, arrests, incarceration, or anything like that. But the most significant attempt at reform was what was called the Macpherson Inquiry in 1999, which gathered so much evidence following a number of racist killings and police inaction in relation to those racist killings, deemed the police to be institutionally racist. So there was an official document, an official legal finding which identified the police as institutionally racist. So while there were a number of recommendations which were put forward in order for the police to deal with this institutional racism, and zero of these recommendations have been implemented, what that finding of institutional racism did was it eroded the confidence and the ability and the PR machinery of the police enormously. And what that erosion of public confidence in policing did was we saw a significant reduction, therefore, in the police's confidence in using stop and search powers, particularly using them in a discriminatory manner. We saw a significant reduction in deaths at the hands of police, particularly of Black people and other people of colour. We saw a reduction in the police lobbying for more powers, for more weapons, and for less oversight. So whilst the actual reforms themselves weren't implemented, the public campaign which led to the Macpherson inquiry, which eventually found the police institutionally racist, saw in importance, although not unfortunately long-term changes to the confidence and resources of the police, which did have a significant impact in policing itself.
Thank you so much. I have a question here from Patricia van Hissenhoven, who just spans up an entirely new dimension here. That's interesting. She writes, Dr. Elliot Cooper mentioned the importance of technology in surveillance. Are policing forces in Latin America and France engaging similar practices? How are police acquiring this data? Could be really generalized to the role of technology in racialized policing.
I'll just say quickly that in sort of lower resource environments like Latin America, there's less of a tendency, at least now, to rely on the kinds of, in the US, you see the stingrays and other types of technology being used, for example, to sort of be able to sort of track people's cell phones and things like that, sort of using big data and tracking social media. This has been less of a practice in Latin America, but the surveillance is an old technology. It's like surveillance as such. Police have for decades been engaged so when we think about the Colombian police, and of course the sort of political policing and enforcement during dictatorships, police surveillance of communities was a deeply entrenched and common practice, and one that did not go away with the transitions to democracy in these contexts. And so I would say it's still a low tech version of this, but what we're seeing now, the sort of turn to body cameras, could be an example of perhaps outside funding being made available to acquire such technology. And so we may see a turn to the sort of more high tech forms of surveillance to complement these sort of long running low tech forms. We may see that coming in the coming years if more funding is made available from the outside for police to acquire such technology.
Who's up?
Yeah, so here, of course, surveillance has a very long history. It's a French word, as is in origin, as is passport and police, in fact. And those concepts and those practices have a very significant history in this country. The modern immigration control system internationally is pretty much modeled, as some really interesting historical work has shown, on what the French government built in the interwar period. If we remember, in the 20s and 30s, France was the #1 destination for immigrants in the world, right? It exceeded the US. And that has continued. One of the biggest manifestations of it that you'll hear about is something called the TAJ. It's a police security database. And it's a database in which the police and the gendarmes register suspects who haven't been convicted of anything, haven't necessarily been interrogated by the police, but for some reason they've decided to put them on a database, and to think they may somehow, potentially now or in the future, be connected to a crime. And in November 2018, there were 18.9 million people on that database, so almost 30% of the population. It's a very heavily surveilled population. At the same time, I'm not sure, in the comparative perspective, my impression, and I'd be interested to hear what Adam thinks, having lived in both countries, I feel like the sharp end of that level of surveillance and the kind of high-tech police surveillance is in the UK. Certainly I can say, from having experienced demonstrations in both countries, the French police are much more interested in dispersal and violence, right? The police here do use tear gas and violent tactics to disperse demonstrations. In the UK, demonstrations seem to be, at least in my experience, much more about intelligence gathering, and there's a much bigger and more prominent police desire to gather intelligence. Of course, also in London, there are many more CCTV cameras than there are in Paris, where there's still a level of resistance to that. So both things at the same time, I think.
Wonderful. Yeah,
Musab's certainly right that surveillance is used far more in the UK context. And to give a couple of illustrative examples, during periods of civil unrest or urban rebellions in the last 10 years, the police have used data capture, which has enabled them to identify. Arrest people, take their mobile phone, and find out from the mobile phone companies what phone, who they've been telephoning over the last 24 or 48 hours. And what they've done is, through that kind of data capture, they've identified who they've been having phone calls with, and then periods in which they've not been engaging in any phone calls at all. And so what the police have said, therefore, is that you've had a number of phone calls with 5 or 6 other people, you've all been phoning or texting each other during a certain period, but then for a number of hours you're not phoning each other, which infers to us that you're all together. And if you're all together, then we can say that if this person was at this specific place and we think they committed that crime, you were all there at that very same time. And that's been used in a legal doctrine called joint enterprise, which can therefore be used to impose significant custodial sentences on large numbers of people by inferring that they were all present when one specific person was present when a particular crime was carried out. So we're seeing the expansion of police powers in enormous ways, not just simply through surveillance, but also by inferring guilt and imposing carceral sentences upon people by the way in which data is used to infer people's existence or presence when a crime is being committed.
Yeah, thank you so much. Another interesting question spanning up yet another dimension is the international kind of follow-up on what happened in the US. Here, Kalfani asks, to all panelists, US-American racialized police violence tends to ignite anti-police activism globally. Can you all speak to why we haven't witnessed the reverse? By this, I mean, global and non-US police violence doesn't seem to gain traction in the US. Why not?
I think one of the reasons for this is that the United States is the global hegemon, right? It's the global cultural hegemon. So American news is global news. Whoever, the US elections are the global elections, right? So I think that when we see protests and when we see any kind of US news, it becomes global news, and there isn't a power on earth that has that kind of influence on other parts of the planet. But also, of course, the Black freedom struggle in the United States is the dominant Black freedom struggle in the world at the moment as well. And so, therefore, the Black freedom movements that emerge out of the United States have a huge impact on Black freedom movements on other parts of the planet as well. And so, I think that and that, of course, those two things are interconnected. And so I think those are the things that lead to these anti-police movements having such an impact in other places. But I think there's a third thing as well, which is important, and that's the focus on the crimes of others. The United States, the United Kingdom, and I'm sure France as well, feels far more comfortable in talking about racism as being an American problem, to talk about police brutality as being an American problem, to divert attention away from the racisms and state violences which its own governments are implicated in. And so it's far more likely that you'll see Black protest and police racism based in the United States being broadcast on mainstream media in the United Kingdom, and far less of our own police violence and protests being documented by the BBC or other mainstream media outlets.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, and it's one that I've often asked myself as somebody who's mostly my research mostly based on Latin America, where police violence exists on a much larger scale and has traditionally displayed much higher rates of brutality and much higher rates of even sort of racialized inequality, etc. I mean, I think that sort of as Andrew said, the sort of the hegemony of the U.S. In sort of in U.S. media, particularly in the developing world, but seemingly in Europe as well, based on Andrew's comments, right? Sort of U.S. cultural production, U.S. media are very dominant in Latin America, and policing has tended to police resources, trainings, etc., has tended to flow from the U.S. to Latin America, right, for at least a century, right? So it's something that the influence of the United States in Latin America is something that also is seen through the high resonance of these police violence cases. But I would also say that there's a lot that the U.S. and U.S. movements could learn from what's going on in Latin America. The way that, for example, Black Brazilians have organized for decades to talk about police violence in a very consistent way is something that ought to be highlighted in addition to their discourse about all of this being a genocide, and a unified discourse that talks about not only police violence, but also homicides, and also other forms of a sort of a letting die, right? A sort of a slow death through the under provision of healthcare, education, jobs, etc. So, for example, this kind of idea of a genocide against Black people is a very mainstream discourse among social movements and even politicians, right? There are sort of congressional investigations of the genocide against Black people happening in Brazil. And so I would say that even though the sort of media structure, global media structures make police violence in the US a lot more salient, there's a lot that the US case and US movements could learn from Latin America as well.
Thank you. Musa.
Yeah, so yeah, great question. And I think here it's a double-edged thing for activists in particular, because on the one hand, we have many well-organized campaigns against police violence and brutality. Usually they emerge following the death of someone in police custody or at the hands of the police. The most prominent one right now is, of course, the Justice pour Adama, and it's run by Adama Traore's sister, Assa Traore. Adama Traore was a French Black man who was killed basically in actually a very similar way to George Floyd, although we don't have a video, in 2016. And there have been, the campaign around, in response to his death, has been very well organized. It's been going on for a number of years. And the French activists here have been keen to stress its independence, the ways in which it's not simply, they aren't simply trying to copy what's happening in the US, and they don't see what's happening here as exactly the same, even though, of course, they're interconnected. So one of the political organizations that I mentioned before, Case Rebelle, they mentioned, there's a Pan-Africanist organization here. They state that one of the things that's so important for them is to decenter the hegemony of African-American discourse within this discourse of global Blackness. And that's something that actually is quite a strong tendency here. There's a strong desire to decenter African-American narratives, not to say that they're not important, but to say that they don't necessarily capture everything about the Black French experience. And bear in mind, of course, the Black French experience often connects to different parts of the world than are necessarily represented. I mean, just based on where the communities here are from and where they have connections to. And there's a desire to try and represent that experience and to represent its uniqueness and its singularity. At the same time, because of the ways in which the global media landscape works and social media works, it's recognized here that when things happen in the US, it provides leverage and it provides space for movements here to do things. So in the wake of the George Floyd protests, there was a huge protest here. I mean, estimates of about 80,000. Actually, at the Tribunal de Paris, the building I mentioned where it emerged that there had been racist abuse in the holding cells. And I thought that was actually a very interesting case in which people were trying to talk about George Floyd and Adama Traore at the same time, and to try and say, well, if you're concerned about that, let's talk about what's happening here. And particularly, I think for a kind of well-meaning, bien-pensant French bourgeois intellectual class, if they're condemning something that's happening abroad, if it's in the press and in the news, it can be a way for French activists, anti-police brutality activists, to say, well, you don't really have much of an excuse for not paying attention to it when it's happening here.
Thank you so much. Now, let me smuggle in my own question quickly, because it would also be for all three of you. I mean, police brutality is, of course, not against migrants or ethnic minorities only, but we have a strong record of police violence against especially left movements in almost all the countries that we're talking about today. So the last examples that we have seen in France, for example, is the Gilets jaunes, which were also not treated kindly by the police. Several people have gone blind. So we have the ritualized, attacks against anti-fascism movements in Germany on May 1st, in Berlin and in other places. We probably have left demonstrations in Brazil as well. So is there a difference that you see in the police tactics, vis-a-vis left demonstrations and vis-a-vis ethnic minorities / migrants in the various countries that you have studied?
I think there's two ways in which we can look at this. I think one of them is kind of conceptual or theoretical. I think that racism provides the infrastructure, the social infrastructure, the material infrastructure necessary for a lot of the kind of police violence, police control, state violence, right? Whether it be classifying groups as being inherently violent, classifying groups as being terrorist organizations, classifying groups as being deviant or criminal. But of course, when we see how this infrastructure is then used, it extends way beyond the racialized communities for which they were who were the initial targets. So one example is the Extinction Rebellion protests, which environmental protests, overwhelmingly white, occupying parts of London and many other cities and towns across the country. Although there was a far lower level of police brutality against them in comparison with the Black Lives Matter protests, where horses were charged at crowds of mainly black young people and other forms of police brutality, we did see the terror legislation being used against Extinction Rebellion to identify these protesters as a terrorist organisation. And we did see the tactics of mass arrest and kettling being used against these protesters as well. So while racism is the mode of governance and the justification and the social and material infrastructure in which the state expands its power, the racialized peoples for which they are the initial targets are not the sole targets when the state needs to be pragmatic in using these kinds of powers and resources against other dissident groups.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would completely agree with Adam on this one, that I think that there's a great fungibility of sort of coercive strategies and repressive strategies that police switch back and forth between using any, the sort of the disfavored group du jour, right? And so the strategies that are developed to repress racial minorities are then used to repress leftists. And this is something that sort of, let's take the Brazilian case in particular. The sort of racialized policing structure developed over the course of sort of slavery were then used to sort of similarly repress workers. In the case of the dictatorship, the same apparatus that developed itself to develop a coercive repertoire of repression that was subsequently used against sort of ordinary crime that of course had the face of the largely Black and largely poor communities. And I just wanted to leave us with this, to not speak for too long, because I could go on about this forever. But there was a great sign that emerged in 2013 when Brazil exploded in protest by a group called Communities United Against Police Violence in Rio de Janeiro's favelas. And the sign just simply said, the same police that's beating you up here on the streets is the same one that kills in the favelas. And so this flexibility between sort of police repression in that is a sort of more routine, ordinary mode of policing in low-income communities, favelas, peripheries, etc., are then turned against sort of all kinds of leftist protests, even when it's middle-class students. And so I think the only difference would be that it is far more deadly against sort of the largely Black, largely poor populations.
Thank you.
So just quickly, I think that, I love Yanilda's phrasing of the fungibility of repressive strategies. I think it's the same here. There's a very big question here politically about whether the violence that was meted out against the Gilets jaunes, which is relatively new in terms of the level of violence against the social movement in recent history, whether that would push certain sectors of the French population to identify with the immigrant neighborhoods of the banlieue, where they normally witness police repression happening pretty happily, right? Because it's not where they live. And that remains an open question. And I think it's a question that's very tied to the role of whiteness within the contemporary French imagination and whether that can be breached in political organizing. The left, the kind of official parliamentary left, has always had a very difficult relationship with these anti-police brutality movements and with political movements in these immigrant neighborhoods and in the banlieue. And we haven't seen yet a kind of coalition emerging that's bringing those together. It's interesting that actually that where the impetus is coming from for that coalition isn't so much from the Gilets jaunes and from these kind of peripheral French towns, villages, suburbs, but from the the black and brown communities here, actually. So the Justice pour Adama campaign has been very active in trying to stake a claim to that discourse, including attending Gilets jaunes protests and trying to vocally express support for those new social movements. But I think whether that can be breached, it remains to be seen. It hasn't yet.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I have a question here from Keegan Boyar that is directly addressed to Yanilda, but I think it can be expanded to all of you. And the question asks that there have been demands for defunding the police in the United States. Are there similar kinds of movements and questions that are raised in your respective countries?
Yeah, I would say that just quickly, because I know we're running short on time, that there are not there's not an explicit defund the police movement in what we're seeing emerge here in the U.S. more recently, but that this investment of in communities, right, using the excuse of sort of we are low-income, middle-income countries, as is the case throughout Latin America, we don't have enough resources to be able to adequately fund education, health, transportation, electrification, etc. Right, even to the point of like having paved roads or having unpaved roads throughout low-income communities go hand in hand with an investment in policing. And so I would just add that there's an added perversion where political discourses, media discourses, etc., sort of then convince these same low-income communities that the only solution is more police. And so this is something that you end up seeing reproduced in many low-income communities. I'll sort of take the example of Brazil, right, where I've seen in community policing meetings that I participated in throughout my field work, people consistently going to these meetings and demanding more police on the ground because dominant discourses in media and political discourses by politicians convince them that the only way to solve their problems is police. And so I think that people acknowledge that more services are needed, more investment in community services, education, health, basic road paving, lighting, electrification, et cetera, are needed. But that the solution that people are presented with over and over again is simply more police. And so we've seen in the case of Sao Paulo, which is what I'm speaking of, their budget increased dramatically, and to the point where they end up substituting other state services. So I've seen police stations with libraries, I've seen police stations with computer centers, running youth soccer matches, and engaging on other sorts of things, and other state entities going through the local police stations to be able to reach communities. And so the police not only is substituting these other services, but ends up absorbing them. And so I would say that the defund is highly relevant. The defund movement should be highly relevant there as well, and we may yet see it emerge.
Thank you.
Yeah, in the French context, it's interesting because yes, the defund discourse has spread here through social media and especially amongst the young. However, there's also an independent, deep skepticism of the police here that's quite separate from those developments and goes back quite a few years. I mean, if you remember in 2016, early 2016, French police unions were already publicly warning that what they called anti-police hatred was completely widespread in France, and that's borne out by surveys. They're the least popular police force in Western Europe. Their level of kind of ideational hegemony has been very low for a while. So in that sense, there's been a kind of what you might call a nascent or inchoate coalition for radical reforms of the police. However, as I mentioned before, that hasn't translated into kind of real legislative initiatives. And although you experience widespread skepticism amongst the population about the police and a desire to cut them down to size and to reduce the power they have and the role that the special role they play within the executive, there has been a less awareness from what I can see of how that should translate into legislative action. The other thing I would say is that in quite a similar way to the US, the question about defund the police versus support the police has become part of a culture war here, and it's become very tied up with left and right discourses. You might have seen, I think it was yesterday, Brigitte Bardot published a statement on Twitter where she said that she's been a kind of vocal supporter of the far right for a while now, but she published a statement where she said she supports the police against the invading scum. And the word she used, scum racaille, is a very well-known racialized word here that refers to residents of the banlieue who are, in her discourse and in the contemporary French far-right discourse, seen as invading because they're seen as replacing the white population of the country. Once that happens, because there's a very big constituency for that, it becomes tied up with national politics as a whole. And, you know, the question of whether any kind of ideation or hegemony can be gained by the idea of defunding the police also really depends upon whether the far right can be defeated as a political force.
Thank you, Adam.
I'm aware we're running over time, so I'll just be very brief and say yes. This the arguments for an abolitionist vision in which the police, the resources and the power of the police is eroded, and communities and social services are empowered, is hugely important. I think the big problem at the moment is not making the kind of neoliberal assumption where you can where there's a finite amount of resources and you take resources from one place and put them into another place, but instead think more of a big picture in which we envisage a world in which we deal with social problems in a way that doesn't rely on causal logics.
Yeah, thank you so much, Adam. You know, thank you all together for this excellent panel and, you know, for these views from other corners of the world. It's now 10 minutes after, and we should probably sort of still leave enough time for a break for everyone, because you know, sort of these Zoom conferences are just easier to manage if you can just recover a little bit in between. So thank you very much. Thank you for the audience staying with us. It's been terrific to have you here. The program will continue at 11:30 with the next panel. Thank you so much and see you all.